1 tablespoon helps restore insulin function. And the more insulin resistant someone is, the more effective it works, because it works alongside pancreatic beta cells to not only help them be more efficient at producing insulin, but also helps signaling devices and nutrient deficiencies to make the insulin work better. So imagine that you just had a bowl of pasta and your glucose is going to skyrocket because you're somewhat insulin resistant. Taking in a tablespoon or somewhat nearby that of molasses can change the amount of insulin required to deal with that bowl of pasta. Sounds too good to be true, and in some ways it is, because if you take too much of it, it can be a problem. So we need to get a little bit granular about how much to use, because it's not the fact that it's a sweetener, it's the fact that it has some really unique properties because it is so mineral and nutrient dense. In this video, we're going to talk about how to use it, specifically if you are dealing with insulin resistance or metabolic dysfunction, because it's a very specific use case for that. Then we're also going to talk about how you can use it in other ways. So we need to get kind of specific about the timing, and we'll talk about each little piece and how you can implement it into your life. There's another thing that's kind of cool, like when you're looking at whole foods that have these effects without maybe the glucose response, bee pollen is one of them as well. So I put a link down below for Beekeeper's Naturals. That is a cool discount link, and you can check out their bee pollen, which has so many cool antioxidant benefits, super rich in B vitamins, super rich in protein, gram for gram, and you're not getting this major spike like you would with honey. But additionally, they have something called propolis. Propolis is really interesting. This is like the sort of defender of the beehive. So you can use it for all kinds of things. One of the ways that I use it is I have allergies. So it seems to help me with that because it helps sort of block a little bit of the histamine response. So you're looking at like bee pollen and propolis. They have all kinds of different products that come from bees. Really cool product. And again, a very special discount link for people that watch my video. You go to beekeepersnaturals.com/DeLauer. That link's in the top line of the description. Bee pollen will change your life when it comes to energy. Like I use it after I fast and I get this big lift of energy without a bunch of calories or without a bunch of carbs. So highly recommend it. It's one of the closest to the earth foods that you can get that really has a powerful impact. How do we use molasses without overdoing it? You see, if you started having like 2 or 3 tablespoons of molasses, you're getting a lot of sugar in there. And that's going to offset the benefit that you're looking for. What we're finding is that based on the literature, there's a nice little sweet spot with molasses. And with that, we look at a mechanistic study that was published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. What they found is that molasses worked really well at helping dysfunctional beta cells in the pancreas produce insulin again. So this means that the body didn't need to pump out as much insulin. It didn't need to stress the pancreas that much. But if you start adding in a lot, molasses still has sugar in it. So you're going to start taxing the pancreas in another way by sheer volume. So you want to use just the right amount. But the other thing they found in this study is that molasses reduces the glucose and fructose uptake of intestinal cells. So that means that it's absorbing glucose and fructose a little bit slower, which gives your pancreas a chance to actually kind of work on it. This is tremendous for like rekindling the ability to use glucose and insulin in the body. So if you're metabolically having some issues, this could help kickstart you. But the study that was really interesting was published in the European Journal of Nutrition, and it found that when they gave subjects a high carbohydrate meal with 5 varying amounts of molasses, what they found is the more molasses that was added, they actually had less insulin required. But in this study, they were using modest amounts. They weren't adding a ton in. It's very important that you look at things like in the teaspoon, tablespoon range, not in the quarter cup range. I don't recommend you start baking with molasses a lot. I want you to almost use it as a tool. Now, one of the reasons that it's doing this is because it's so nutrient dense and has so many minerals. So for one, it has a lot of magnesium in it. We know from a lot of different studies that magnesium deficiency is related to insulin resistance as well. Magnesium is required for what is called autophosphorylation of insulin receptors. So we have insulin that's produced by the pancreas when we eat carbohydrates. So let's say you're having some carbs, you're having a nice meal, and all of a sudden like you start feeling like high blood sugar, you start feeling cruddy. Well, that's because the pancreas is trying to produce enough insulin, but it's having a hard time keeping up with the glucose because those beta cells are somewhat resistant. So what happens is it can send things into overdrive and you end up with high insulin all the time because your blood sugar is staying high. So when magnesium's in the equation, it helps the insulin receptor actually absorb the insulin better so it can do its job. So you're having less chronically circulating insulin. Chronically high circulating insulin is going to make it so that you're in more of that absorptive phase. So if you have a hard time like losing weight, if you have a hard time keeping it off, it could be simply because you have chronically high circulating insulin and you're always kind of turned into absorptive mode versus burning mode. Sure, there's the calories in, calories out discussion, but then there's also the whole idea of chronically high circulating insulin, which is impeding fat loss. So the whole idea here is molasses makes it so that you require less insulin when you have carbohydrates. It's like, oh my gosh, this makes it so that I don't have to have the risk of chronically high circulating insulin. Now we have to ask ourselves when the best time to take this in would be. Well, with that, we have to go with the process of elimination in some ways. I'm not a big fan of having a bunch of carbohydrates in the morning. Why? Well, because you're already in a low insulin state. And what that means is, quite frankly, you're in a pretty unique position to be able to burn a little more fat. I'm usually a fan of keeping it relatively low carb in the morning. I also don't like having a blood sugar spike and then a crash later in the day. I don't care who you are, insulin resistant or not, you probably feel that in some way or another. Feel a little brain foggy after you have a bunch of oatmeal or something like that. It's not necessarily about the food specifically, it's about maybe that's not the best time to just have a bunch of carbs. So personally, it doesn't make a lot of sense to have the molasses with breakfast because unless you're loading up a bunch of carbs, then why would you want to add the molasses with protein or fat? It's not going to really help you much there other than maybe some antioxidants that I've talked about in other videos. So ideally, you'd want to keep it out of the breakfast. But then what about with dinner? Well, dinner, you could make the argument that it could help keep insulin a little bit more stable throughout the night, which might help you out in some ways. But then we have to look at the literature and we find out that, well, if you have it in the sort of evening time, you're delaying the gastric emptying. It increases GIP, it increases amylase, but then it also has an ability to block what's called alpha amylase and alpha glucosidase, which means it's delaying sugar absorption. And again, at first you think, well, this is great. Like I want to have something low glycemic at night. The problem is that when you have something low glycemic at night, or you actually delay the effect more so, you have an initial spike when you consume those carbs, and then you might have a secondary spike. And that could be happening well after you're asleep. So some people find that if they have low glycemic carbs, they delay digestion too much with dinner, it actually affects their sleep. And that's, may or may not happen to you. But the time that's probably the safest time to have it, and when makes the most sense, is to do about 1 to 2 tablespoons with your lunch, okay? Now, if you're having carbohydrates with lunch, perfect recipe for it, right? Let's say you go out, you're at work, you go out and you have a sandwich, or you go out and you have some starches. Well, what's going to happen is the molasses is going to delay that absorption, okay? But it's also going to lessen the insulin load on your body, making it so you feel a little bit better throughout the afternoon, but more so you don't end up having those weird cravings that come in at 3, 4, 5 p.m. or the invasion of the body snatchers cravings that come in right when you get home from work. So it's a really good time to do it with lunch because you're not affecting sleep, you're not forcing yourself to have carbs with breakfast if you don't want them, and you're mitigating some of the damage that comes with carbs at lunch. So it's a really unique kind of spin on when to do it. Now let's get into the specifics of how much you may want to have. Okay, if you look at the actual antioxidant profile, all you really need is a tablespoon of molasses. You could probably get by with even less, right? So you want to treat it as somewhat of a supplement. You want to have it with your carbohydrates, and you really don't want to go over 2 tablespoons. There's no real reason to. Even if you were to bake with it, it doesn't make a lot of sense to go over 2 tablespoons. I would recommend using something more like honey that probably has a little bit better taste when you're baking with it, and maybe just use the actual molasses to kind of work as a carb delayer or a carb blocker. The other thing that you want to remember, and I've talked about this in other videos, is having molasses with a high sugar meal is very different than having molasses with a high starch meal. Most of the evidence suggests that molasses helps with high starch meals. The reason that it does is because it's blocking amylase, it's blocking glucosidase, and it's just delaying those starch chains from breaking down. And it's already requiring lower amounts of insulin with a starch anyway, and it's allowing sort of the insulin to keep up. So if you had it with sugar, you're really just adding more sugar to sugar, even though molasses has a benefit. So use it with starches and not with sugar. So I did some other videos on how some certain supplements like Carnosine can have a huge impact on insulin resistance. So I linked out to that video right here. As always, keep it locked here on my channel. I'll see you tomorrow.